Good morning, everyone. My name is Bill McAlpine. I am privileged to teach practical theology here at Ambrose University, and it's my joy to be a part of the research team of the Flourishing Congregations Institute. One of the things, if I may just say for me personally, that has been such an enriching benefit for me to be involved in this whole project is I get to work with such outstanding colleagues across the disciplines. It's very easy for us to get into our silos, both academically and denominationally, and we just talk to our own kind. And one of the most enriching things for me is to be able to meet people such as are represented in my becoming friends with me here on the platform. What we're going to do for the next about 25 or 30 minutes is hear stories. One of the most exciting things about the research we are doing is listening to people's stories. And so what we would like to do is I'm going to introduce my fellow panelists here, and then I'm going to basically turn them loose within certain limits. You know, it's a dangerous thing. You get pastors and preachers and you turn them loose. That's really silly. So we'll try to have some, and what we'd like to hear from them is some stories of flourishing that they have experienced in their particular context. But let me introduce them to you first of all. On my far right is Father Jerome Lavigne, who is vicar for Catholic education and pastor at St. Patrick's in Calgary, Alberta. Father Jerome was born in Hull, Quebec, was raised in Calgary and Canmore. He was ordained to the priesthood in the Diocese of Calgary in 2009. As is written in his biography, when you listen to him speak, you always come away feeling challenged and inspired. Father Jerome has a way of unpacking the mysteries of the spiritual life in a way that is down to earth, as is unmistakably orthodox. The first time I met Father Jerome was, I think, one of our very first gatherings here at Ambrose, and I remember catching myself thinking almost out loud several times when he made a comment like that. I remember thinking to myself, man, I wish an Alliance guy had said that. Next to him is Pastor Jeremy Duncan. Pastor Jeremy is lead pastor at Commons Church in the Kensington area of Calgary. First time I saw Jeremy, he was solemnizing nuptial vows. In other words, he was marrying a couple. And I was duly impressed with how he handled the sacrality and the down-to-earthness of marriage. He's been a pastor for a while, then he wasn't, then he was again, apparently. And then in 2014, he started the Commons Church in Calgary. 4 years later, Commons is deeply invested in the Kensington neighborhood where Jeremy lives with his family, and Commons has just launched a new parish in Inglewood, not far from there. Commons is committed to continue the revitalization of the neighborhood church for urban Calgary. So welcome, Jeremy. Welcome, Father Jerome. And then lastly, but not least, of course, is Reverend Father, sorry. That's,
Is that a promotion?
that's an ecumenical thing. John Pentland is the spiritual leader, public speaker, theologian, and lead minister at Hillhurst United Church here in Calgary. For 30 years, John has lived in Alberta. He has served in rural churches, and he worked for the United Way for a number of years as well, before joining Hillhurst United Church in 2004. He has authored a book, a Canadian seller book, that's the one that's available, called Fishing Tips: How Curiosity Transformed a Community of Faith. So welcome to you, my brothers. It's so great to have you with us for taking the time. Now, enough of me. What I would like to have you do is just to convey to us some of the ways in which, with a story or two, in which you have seen things that have contributed to flourishing in your particular context, and if there have been specific or strategic combinations of dynamics or elements that you think have played a key role in the flourishing element. So, John, I'll start with you, and if that gives you enough guidance, away you go.
Okay, thank you. As Joel was giving the statistics, I was thinking about it. 24% of the population is none and growing. When I think about the flourishing of congregations, I think that our attention needs to be on those who are not there. And so when we talked about Jeremy leaving the church and coming back to the church, so did I. I was in a rural church, suburban church, left the church. That was the best thing in ministry, because you realize the world moves along without us. We're not the center of the universe. And so the story I want to tell that typifies this is one Sunday morning early on in my ministry at Hillhurst. I was getting ready for Sunday morning, and ministers, as you know, kind of organize the front of the pulpit and clean things up. And I looked out and I saw a woman in the back row hugging her Starbucks coffee. I had met her in another organization when I worked at United Way. She waved me over and she said to me, "I've never been to a baptism, wedding, or funeral. What do I need to know?" Okay? Great line. What do I need to know? And so I would say flourishing for us happens when we think about who's not here and how do we say things and do things to the people who are maybe walking in for the very first time. And people sniff us out when they show up in our church. They sniff. Is it real? Is it authentic? And so if we can speak and act in ways for a woman like Stephanie, who's never been there, what do I need to know? Everything we do is on my mind every Sunday. I think about Stephanie. So for me, it's what do we need to know, and how do we pay attention to the nuns, not the ones who are there. They're very important, of course. But the ones who aren't here, how do we speak and engage with the world that I think is starved to be engaged in a meaningful way?
Thank you. Thank you. Jeremy.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about our story at Commons, really quickly here, I planted a church about 4 years ago in Kensington area. 4 years in, we sort of average about 900 on a weekend now. We run 4 services on Sunday. We just launched another parish about 5 minutes away in a new neighborhood. But when we look at the makeup of our church, we do a couple surveys a year to see where people are coming from. And about 42% of people who are new to Commons tell us that they grew up with Christianity but have not attended church in more than 3 years. So when we talk about the nuns and that 24%, that's about 16% of our new people are people who say they have no Christian background. But what Commons has really seemed to resonate with is a lot of people who are on the verge of that growing group, and they've stepped away from church consciously, but they haven't totally left the idea that Christianity is significant, that it's important for them. And so we've always tried to find ways to reconnect those people back to their faith, to find ways to talk about it that address some of the reasons that they stepped away. To talk in, for us, that's more progressive ways that address some of their concerns around religion and its place in the world. And we found there is a huge group of people that are on the verge of becoming nuns, but are actually really engaged if you can find the right ways to speak and to bring life back to faith. And that's where Commons has sort of really found its niche. What will be interesting is we're kind of built for Calgary right now, where there's a lot of people on the verge of being a nun. I think in 10 years from now, those people won't be around. And it won't be the people stepping away from Christianity. It will be their kids who grew up without Christianity. And churches like Commons will have to reinvent themselves again to reach out to people who don't have any background. We're not reconnecting them with something. We're starting from scratch the way that John was talking about. And so I think that's something we're going to see more and more in the next decade, at least here in Calgary anyway.
Thanks, Jeremy. Father Jerome.
Well, the first thing that I would say is we need to contextualize the reality of where we're experiencing ministry these days. And in the wake of the sexual abuse scandals in the Catholic Church, it's an invitation for all priests, bishops, anyone who's in a leadership position to, first of all, look at themselves and their authenticity and their relationship with Christ and how they're living their life as a quest for holiness of life. That's the first thing. Second thing is, before I was ever showing up at any parish, God is already at work in those people's lives, drawing them through their personal life story on their quest and search for God. In other words, whether they are what we call them nuns. That's so funny because in our context, nuns means something else, but I like that. But even the nuns, the human heart is built in such a way that it thirsts for God. And I love how John put it, people sniff it out. and they will sniff us out now more than ever when it comes to authenticity and literally living your life as a true witness of Christ, not just in the church, but even at home when the doors are closed. And that's where we're at now, and we're not going back from this new state of being. So how do we inspire people to come and to stay with us? The approach that I seek to keep in mind, to bring to prayer and to bring to the leadership team within the parish, is to offer people some type of a transcendent experience in their worship. If we can have our liturgies, or how you break open the word in such a way where people's spirit are literally lifted out of themselves and able to connect with the presence of God, that's fantastic. So something transcendent in your worship. Another avenue is to meet the people where they're at. We're in a parish at St. Patrick's. We have 9 seniors' homes that we look after. And that means Mass once a month, but also every week we're there to break open the Word or to pray the Rosary, but just to be there for them at that stage of life. So how do we meet our people, if it's young families with kids, where they're at, and those who are now in seniors' homes? So there's that dimension as well. And the third dimension is to bring people into the intellectual sphere. People are starving for truth. They're starving for stimulation. They're starving to learn more, because the catechesis growing up, and I love how you mentioned that, who's going to come back to the churches, it's the kids who grew up without Christianity. And we're seeing that in our Catholic schools. And that's the generation that is so hungry, and they're starving for it. And the challenge that we face today, reality of my life as a priest, we've lost all of our complete moral footings. We've lost complete trust. And the only way that we're going to survive and go through is through authenticity and holiness of life. And people will sniff it out, because we're under suspicion now 24/7. You wear this around in public, you'll feel it through the eyes of those who see you in public. So it's just a different time, and how are we going to flourish through that? As the church began through martyrdom, the church will continue to flourish through the ways she began, and we're just flipping into a new chapter. And so here we go.
Thank you so much. What I'd like to ask all three of you, just to reflect for a little bit on as well, is can you tell us of a challenge specific to your context that, for all intents and purposes, could have mitigated against flourishing, but that in fact perhaps enhanced? And how did you navigate through a challenge like that? Either any of you want to start?
I can say something. I would say our community right now is about a third a United Church, a third statistically a former evangelical or former Catholic, and a third is non-church. And so that's a great diversity of people. We keep each other honest. There's great questioning, debating, discussion about how we do. Father, for me, when you were talking about the importance of the intellect, at this stage and age, in my experience, I think people are looking not so much for an engagement with the mind, but with the heart. I know you're not saying that completely, but that sense of experience and relationality. And I would say I got really lucky showing up at the church I was at. My colleague who was there prior to me did a lot of hard work, tilled the ground, got rid of the right people, made the right place safe for me to come in. And they basically said, you're the last minister, do whatever you want. Now, if you get that kind of permission, that is brilliant. And if you really had that opportunity to say, this is what I really want to do because I'm the last one that's going to be here, what would you do? And so for that first couple of years, I had the privilege of being able to say, hold on, you called me to lead. You said I'm the last minister. You want to engage with the community. Do you want to or not? And fortunately, the community was really open to say, yes, we want you to do that. And so I would say some of the barriers can be the people we work with. Are they stuck in a time that doesn't exist anymore? I had to remind people all the time that the church is about who's not born yet, that we need to be preparing the land for the future and the community for the future. And so I think the helpful piece can be people are willing to say it's not about me, it's about the future. And churches that are talking about that kind of vulnerability, that kind of risk really matter. And so I would say, the last thing I would want to say is communities that are willing to risk and truly risk are the ones that I think that will thrive and survive in great ways.
I mean, I'm game to talk about practical stuff that we've done and any of that kind of stuff, if that's helpful. But I think one of the things that has been a challenge that we've realized in the last year to 18 months and tried to address is I'm a white, straight man who's planted a church in urban Calgary. And the church grew very quickly. And what we did was we looked around and realized a lot of our community was white and straight, and also women too, but they weren't all men, but that was who we were. And that was not really reflective of the community that we were in. And so our community and our board sat down and said, we need to make some changes if we want to be reflective of who's around us. We were sort of intellectually, where were people at in their engagement with Christianity and faith? We were representing that community, but not with some other ways of diversity. And so our board took it on themselves to say we needed to hire people of color, put them in valuable positions of visible leadership, and we needed that on our board. And so in the last year, we brought 2 women of color onto our preaching team, elevated them roles, and then had our nomination committee look for people of color in our community to be on our leadership team and on our board and leading in visible ways. And what's remarkable is there's a lot of communities, I think, particularly within Christianity in a city like Calgary, that look very white and don't look representative of their communities. In 18 months, just by elevating leadership that looks like the neighborhood around us, the community has shifted in pretty dramatic ways. Obviously still, in Kensington community, the community is probably primarily white and Caucasian, but the demographics, even in our attendance, has shifted quite dramatically just by some visible changes to who's on the stage, who's leading, who's representing, who's speaking, those types of things. And so those are some challenges where Commons realized if we're going to continue to grow, if we're going to continue to connect with more people in this neighborhood, we need to be more representative of the people we're trying to connect to.
Excellent, thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy. And I just want to share with you where we're at with regards to that situation. We are in a different boat whereby the priests in our diocese, over 80% of them are international priests, 80%. What that means is we cannot even sustain the demands of the work that's in our home backyard with vocations coming forward. And so we thank God for our international priests that are able to come here and help us to continue to minister to those who are within our churches at this time. One of the challenges that we face within some of the existing congregations that are established for a while would be, for example, I was just transferred to St. Patrick's in August, and it's a very busy place with the 7 weekend masses and everything that goes with that. So you have a lot of little groups, and everybody has a fantastic idea, and we're going to start this, and I think we got 4 Bible study groups, and the challenge is that you've got all these fragments, and everybody has their camp. And so how do you unite that so that we can continue to reach out to the masses? And my response would be to encourage what already exists, because it's a movement of the Spirit. Do not quelch it, or it'll come back to bite you. And then place the focus on the bigger banner. And the bigger banner is this: we all got to get to heaven. We all have to get to heaven. So no matter what groups are going on and who's doing this outreach, this, that, and the next thing, truth speaks to all and through all. And so it comes back to how do you offer, whether it's a speaker coming in or a series that will encapsulate everything that's going on within the whole denomination that's within at work for you. And I've found that that actually invigorates all the small groups to do even more, and it reaches people outside those groups as well. So reminding people of the basics in truth with charity as best as you can.
Great, thank you. Just 2 more questions, and then we're going to invite you to engage in some conversation around your tables as a follow-up to this. What would your advice be to the leadership of a congregation that finds himself in a context, in a community that has changed significantly? I'll give you an example. My dad pastored in Toronto for 17 years. When we first went to this church, it was known as Little Italy. You could not walk anywhere within a mile and a half. Well, within a mile and a half radius of the church, there were 27,000 Italians. It smelled wonderful when they were making wine and spaghetti. It was really a great neighborhood. But the last time I went back to that church, the Italian community has moved, migrated, and it is now Caribbean island folks. That has radically changed the community. So that seems like that's going to happen. Maybe it has happened in your context. And in light of that, what advice would you give, particularly I'm thinking to lay leadership? How do you adjust, accommodate? Because all three of you have said something about how important it is to be in that neighborhood, in touch, to reach out your community. So to the lay leaders of your churches, what would you say needs to be in place, or how do they, as lay leaders, need to navigate changes like that in their context? That's a preacher asking a really simple question, convoluted as it is. But
I can try to answer. I would say, again, looking back when I got at Hillhurst, realizing that we weren't sure what we wanted to do and where we were headed. And the most important thing we did about 12 years ago was hire a consultant to come and work with the congregation for 8 months to discover what the values are of the community. And the process of discovering those values in small table groups over 8 months developed strong community, connection, commitment. They named the core values of hospitality. That was very important to us. Spirituality, we have weekly teachings and classes on soul work. Social justice, how do we make change in the world? How do we put our faith into action? And we just added a fourth one called risk. And I love that the church values risk. And so these 4 values are named on Sunday publicly. They're also at our board meetings. We have a board meeting. At the start of the board meeting, we say we need 3 listeners to listen to the board meeting, somebody to listen to what's confidential, what requires teamwork, and when they heard our values being lived in the work we did. And so that keeps them alive. And so my advice, I would say, is that communities that know what they value means they're only going to do certain things. They're going to say, as an example, we say this, if someone comes to our church looking for a healing ministry, we say we don't do that, but Parkdale, just down the road, does fantastic healing ministry. If we know another community that's looking for more traditional music, we can point them in another direction. So the last thing I'll say in this, because the consultant is now at Hillhurst United Church after 10 years, he's back working with us, and he has said that he did that work with congregations with 15. And he said that our church happened to be the only one that actually did the values. And so lots of churches do the process, they put them in a filing cabinet, but they never do anything about it. And so churches that know what they value, I've been to your church when you name them, you can read them, you can see them, people pick up what you're about and why you're doing it. And I think that as lay people say, this is what we do and what we don't do. Let other people specialize in their particular area.
Yeah, I mean, I think John's hitting on something really important. I think churches have to understand why they exist, and not in the general sense of why church exists, but why this particular expression of church exists. What's it for? I think in terms of the larger question, for us, it's really important to have a theology of place. We are a community, but we exist within a specific neighborhood. And this is why when we outgrew that, we planted another parish, and we have a pastor who's over there, and we're trying to figure out that neighborhood. And one of the things that we did when we moved into Kensington to plant was to take the first couple of years to really get to know every agency, every other faith community in the neighborhood, to get to know John down the street. He works down the street from me. But to get to know all these other agencies and figure out how we were going to be present in this particular neighborhood. And I think there has been a large trend over the last couple decades, particularly in Calgary, where Calgary has been a suburban city, to think that place doesn't really matter, and you travel to your church, and you travel to your work, and you travel to your home. And I think what's happening for anybody under the age of 40 right now, nobody is dreaming about their single detached home in the suburbs anymore. That's not a thing in Calgary. Anyone under the age of about 35 is dreaming about the townhouse, they're dreaming about the condo, they want to be in the urban neighborhood, they want to be close to their work, they want to be close to their grocery store, they want to know their neighbors. And that necessitates a rethinking of what church looks like, because it's no longer a thing that you go to and you experience and then you go home. And so for us at Commons, one of the big things we did this year, we've started a new scholarship for moms that are finishing high school. But the reason for that is because right across the street from us is Louise Dean, which is Catholic Family Services in partnership with the CBO, or CBE, and what they do is they run high school for moms who are finishing high school but have to look after their kids. Well, it's one of our biggest partnerships. It's $40,000 a year we're pouring in there for hot meals, for pharmacy cards to make sure they can get their prescriptions, and scholarships for post-secondary. The reason for that is, yes, it's good work, but the biggest reason is they are our literal neighbors across the street from us. And I think that's really important when we're thinking about how we're going to inhabit a neighborhood, how we're going to do this, is we have to be thinking about place. If our concept of church is just generic, it's not going to connect with people anymore. It has to be, this is what we do in this neighborhood, this is why we exist in this particular time and place. And the tighter you get with that, and the tighter you get what John is saying about who we are and why we are, then I think that's really compelling for people. People want to be part of something, but they want to be part of something specific.
Thank you, Jeremy.
One of the blessings that I find myself experiencing is that the church dictates for us how we're going to be worshiping. When the Mass begins to its end, it's very structured in its experience. That experience speaks to many people who come to have that encounter with God, but as we can see on a day-to-day level, we've got the whole world showing up through that front door. Different nationalities, cultures, backgrounds. And for example, at St. Patrick's, we have very strong Filipino culture now that's within the parish. And they love to worship in their own way. For example, between the Masses on a Sunday from 1 till 4, they're in one of the boardrooms singing songs and worshiping. But for other folks, well, we went to Mass, and now we're going to do other things. How do you make it so that they're nourished when they come to us from a different perspective, background, and traditions? And the only answer that I can facilitate with regards to our own experience is we support them so much as it gives them some life, but not start to take the life from the overall picture of the entire congregation. And what I mean by that is that they would like to take things on whereby it'll start to change the whole dynamic of who you say, well, this is who we are. And we have to be, we church leaders, you need to be able to draw that line in the sand and say, this is what happens here. We can meet you and respect what you're bringing up to that point. Are we cool with that? And I find if you're clear and you have that discussion, it will be respected. We get in trouble when we just sort of say, okay, yeah, let's just try this and let's try that. And next thing you know, you got 15 things being tried and they're all crushing toes one upon the other. And so here calls for leadership and just some clear discussions that at times I know it's uncomfortable for many of us, but that's how we safeguard the dignity of who we are and why we're there.
This has been so good. Thank you so much. We have 5 minutes, and before we break into their groups, my last question for you, brothers, is what one pithy, cogent bit of advice would you give to pastors, based on your experiences, based on some of the stuff we've discussed this morning? What one bit of advice would you give to pastors who are here today? Pithy, cogent.
I got a real quick. We saw Peter Kreeft once as a seminarian. He was teaching. He was in Portland giving a talk, and we bust in. And after the lecture series, he's out shaking hands, and one of the seminarians goes up to him and says, "Dr. Kreeft, that was so awesome. Listen, we're all studying here to become priests. What's the one piece of advice you'd give to us as future leaders in the church?" And I thought to myself, oh gosh, he's not going to answer that. But he got all serious, and he stared at the ground, and he's scratching his head, and he looks up at us, and he says, "Be a saint." Being a saint is the greatest gift that the church can offer to the world, and that's what the church needs now more than ever. So I'm quoting Dr. Peter Kreeft, just be a saint.
Yeah. Well, if I was going to steal a line, because apparently that's allowed, I actually remember Eugene Peterson talking and getting a similar question, and his answer was, learn people's names and perform the sacraments. And it was the same kind of response, like this is what you do as a pastor. But I actually love that because I think this is what we need to recapture more and more, is that local presence of actually knowing the people who are in your communities, allowing those communities to reflect back into the leadership and how the church is going to grow and change, and then allowing yourself to be that religious presence in the community. You know, the sacraments are an interesting thing because I come from that Protestant side of the tradition, which moved away from the sacraments, and I'm seeing a lot of people my age and younger actually moving back towards that and saying, I want an experience of something that sounds sacred, that feels sacred, that doesn't sound like what I hear on the radio or experience at work. And I think there's something really unique about that in creating those moments. More than that, what I would say personally is this. I do a lot of coaching with church planters now, and the big issue I find is when people are starting, when a church is small and it wants to reinvent, they're always too afraid to be too specific because they think the more narrow we get with our identity and our concept, the more that's going to exclude people. And we're desperate to get people, so we need to be as broad as possible. And I tell them all the time whenever I'm doing coaching, no, this exact opposite, because people are not looking for a lowest common denominator experience of spirituality. They want a unique, personalized experience. And so the tighter you can be about who we are and why we do this and why we're important in this particular neighborhood, yes, you're going to exclude 70 or 80% of the people in the neighborhood. But the 20% that really resonate with what you do are actually going to give you the opportunity to speak to them, to learn their names, to perform the sacraments, and to invite them into community. So my pithy advice would be really figure out who you are, what you're doing, and why you do it in this particular space that you find yourself.
Mine's two-part. I remember when I was thinking about going into ministry, I was at Queen's University finishing a BA. I went to a colleague, a family friend who was teaching New Testament, and I said, I'm thinking about being a minister, but I don't feel good enough. And she looked me in the eye and she said, it's not about you. It's not about how good you are. It's about who God is. And so it was really a freeing thing to recognize that it's not about me. But I also want you to know that I think ministry is lonely. It's very lonely. It's hard work. Often we as colleagues aren't as good to each other as we could be. We're competitive and critical. And I think that it's lonely work, it's hard work. My grandfather said, why would you ever want to be in a business that everybody's your boss? And he was right. Everybody thinks they know how to do your job better. But I think my advice to people in ministry would be to be yourself, to trust that you, just as you are with your frailty and your failings and your weakness and your strength and your beauty, is who God is calling. And I believe in what's called horizontal transcendence, that God is not up in the clouds watching us, but in each and every person. And so the better we are able to be just as we are, admitting our mistakes and our failures, and cheering for each other, literally cheering for each other. My dream is to see a stained glass window with Jesus with pom-poms, because I believe Jesus is cheering for everybody. And if we could just get that for each other, the world would be a better place. So ministry is super hard work. It's not easy. And if the better we were to be able to support each other, which the institution does not do well, the better we're able to make the connections and support each other, the better we'll all be.
Well, thank you so much. I trust that in this last 30 minutes or so, you've been able to glean some of the wealth that you won't find in textbooks and we can't produce in the classroom. So I want to thank you, Father Jerome and Jeremy, John. Thank you guys so much. I know I'm going to be leaving here with a whole new image of Jesus with pom-poms.